Thank you, Dr. Reed. My name is Michael Polson. I'm the director of the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley, and this is part of our conversation series that we're holding this semester and last semester to highlight uh, research that's being done and has been done in California around cannabis-related issues that are, up the alley of the Cannabis Research Center, which largely focuses on issues of cultivation, ecology in the communities around and living with cannabis. So welcome everybody. And next slide. So yeah, I'm gonna leave the introduction to Seth LaRosa, a graduate student here at UC Berkeley, to introduce Dr. Reed. And then there'll be about a 30-minute conversation and then followed by a Q&A. At the very end, then I'll pop back in after going off camera just to highlight a few other things that are coming up. And with that, let's see, one more slide, I think, actually. One back. Yeah. So this is in a meeting format. So you were invited at any point to just insert questions into the chat function at the bottom, or maybe at various moments Seth will ask for questions, and you're always free to ask them by unmuting yourself. I think everyone's entering muted, but you're always able to ask just in person too if you'd like to. That's better for you. And there's always a react button too. If you want to just give a thumbs up or a heart, it's always appreciated. And I believe that's it, right? What's the next slide? Great. Okay. And with that, I'll hand it over to Seth.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth LaRosa. I'm a graduate student researcher here at Berkeley, and I'm a research associate with the Cannabis Research Center. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kaitlin Reed, who is Yurok, Hoopa, and Oneida, and is an associate professor of Native American Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt. She serves as her university's Traditional Ecological Knowledge Faculty Fellow and is the co-director of the Ro Dalugur Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledge Institute. Her research is focused on tribal land and water rights, extractive capitalism, and settler colonial political economies. Her first book, Settler Cannabis, From Gold Rush to Green Rush in Indigenous Northern California, was published by the University of Washington Press in 2023. It's received the 16th Annual Labriola National Indian Data Center Book Award in 2024. And Kaitlin obtained her BA degree in geography from Vassar College and her master's and her PhD in Native American Studies at the University of California in Davis. She's an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe and lives in Northwestern California. Hi, Kaitlin.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Ayukli, everybody. I'm really impressed that you all are at a Zoom webinar on a Friday afternoon. So kudos, and I'm really excited to be here and talk about this work.
Well, thank you again for being here. Well, to start us off, could you give us just a kind of a brief overview of what inspired Settler Cannabis? What drove you to take on the project, and what questions were you originally hoping to answer?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I often joke that it was never my intention to write a book about cannabis, and here we are. I tell a story in the book that when I was an undergraduate, and so I was in upstate New York at the time, I was in my dorm room, and it was like kind of like first day, like first week of school, getting to know your flatmates type of situation. And we were going around the circle and everyone was sharing where they were from. And I said, like, I'm originally from Humboldt County, but I've kind of moved around. And they zoned out after I had said Humboldt County, and like everyone's eyes lit up, and they were so excited that like they would have this like connection to like Humboldt grown cannabis. I kind of wasn't thinking about it critically at the time, but now, like looking back years later, right, my kind of path to studying the impacts of cannabis cultivation in Yurok territory kind of started my first week of my freshman year of school, when everyone assumed I would be able to provide this connection. And so I started kind of thinking over the years, like how this crop that is being cultivated in my indigenous homelands, right, is making its way 3,000 miles east to the eastern seaboard, where it was being sold at the time I was an undergraduate for like $65 for an eighth of an ounce. And so it kind of started there. And when I was finishing towards the end of my undergraduate experience, I spent a summer as an intern for the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. It's now called the Yurok Tribe Environmental Department. And at that time, I was just intern helping folks do some water quality sampling and surveys. And really, it was a way for me to kind of connect with my homelands, because I was born here, and then my family moved when I was very young. So I didn't get to kind of reconnect with my own territory until I was a young adult. And so I returned the following summer as an environmental technician. And that was the kind of the summer in between my undergraduate career and when I was about to start graduate school at the University of California, Davis. And that summer, I was sitting at my desk doing some basic data entry for the department. And we all got forwarded a LA Times article that Operation Yurok had started. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, Operation Yurok is a tribally spearheaded cannabis eradication campaign that got started in 2014 as a and so the Yurok tribe worked with the governor's office to receive funds out of a emergency drought relief funding to coordinate a campaign to be able to address some of the illicit cannabis cultivation. And at that point, the tribe's concern was primarily unregulated and illegal water diversions. And so kind of some of the extreme impacts that the tribe was seeing were that entire streams were being dewatered, right? The decrease in water quantity was then directly impacting water quality. And for those who may be unfamiliar, Yuroks we're salmon people, right? We're river people. And so we saw kind of an immediate impact on the day-to-day life of a lot of our tribal members. And so that fall, I started graduate school. And I was reading all of these amazing California Indian studies scholars and indigenous histories of California. And I was really struck by a lot of the parallels that I was seeing happen on the Yurok Indian Reservation and within our ancestral territory that we'll get to explore in our conversation today. And one of the things I was really struck by was the lack of tribal representation or voice within cannabis discourse, kind of at a popular media level. And so I realized that Native peoples weren't really given a seat at the gold rush at the table, right? And so I was like, well, I'll be damned if I'm not going to let like indigenous perspectives and experiences, right, be part of this larger conversation. And so my running joke is that I utilize the popularity of cannabis discourse to trick unsuspecting cannabis enthusiasts to learn an accurate history of California. And so I really see my work and my role as a researcher as much more of a researcher of settler colonialism than I see myself as a researcher of cannabis. Cannabis just happened to be the thing that was happening in my ancestral territory at the time I began graduate study. And so I really want to kind of frame the work that I do within the context of settler colonialism rather than, say, cannabis studies. And at this point, I'd like to show folks a couple maps, just because I anticipate some of you may be unfamiliar with the region that I am looking at and talking about. And so we're very far in Northern California. I know lots of people think you all are in Northern California, but we're like close to the Oregon border. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. So here's just two maps that I'll show briefly, and I'll stop my screen share here in a moment. The map you're looking at on the left was created by our tribal GIS department. And there's two things that I'd like to flag here. You'll see the red boundary that goes from the mouth of the Klamath River, 44 miles upriver, and that our reservation extends 1 mile on each side of the riverbank, right? But our reservation is a small fraction of our ancestral territory. And this border is important and not important. It is not important because we have a relationship and obligation to care and steward our entire ancestral territory, regardless of our reservation status or jurisdiction status. However, that boundary is also very important because it limits the Yurok tribe's ability to respond to impacts outside of that boundary. And so, for example, one of the situations that we had to deal with during Operation Yurok was that a trespass cultivation site could be sited just adjacent of the reservation boundary, but if it wasn't within the reservation boundary, the tribal nation would not have jurisdiction to intervene, right? And so that was part of the necessity of Operation Yurok, was to create kind of a cross collaboration approach so that no matter where the site was located, somebody in the crew would have jurisdiction. And one story that I often think about, there was a trespass site that was located just on the exterior of the reservation boundary, but they had put a pipe that crossed the reservation boundary to divert water. And all the tribe was legally allowed to do at that point was cut the pipe at the boundary of the border, which of course they're going to show up and put up another pipe in tomorrow, right? And then I also like to include this map on the right. This was created by a Yurok artist and cartographer. She's a graduate student currently in environment and community at Cal Poly Humboldt. Her name is Tori McConnell. She's actually the former Miss Indian World. But I like to couple it with this map that incorporates Indigenous place names. So here you can see some of the adjacent tribes in Northwestern California. And while my work primarily focuses on the Yurok tribe and their response to trespass cultivation, several other tribes in our region, such as Hupa, Karuk, Wiyot folks, are also experiencing some of these same types of issues. So I'm going to stop my screen share here. I just wanted folks to be able to see that map. And then I'd like to provide just a couple caveats of things I like to say when I talk about my work. And so to be clear, my work is focused on trespass or illicit cultivation. The kind of surge in regulated or legal cannabis cultivation was kind of nearing the end of my field work. And so I like to be very kind of transparent that primarily I'm discussing the impacts of trespass cultivation, although that isn't to say there aren't also impacts with regulated cultivation as well, but my focus is trespass cultivation. And my primary focus is how tribal nations are responding to the issue. I was less kind of concerned in strategies for growers or strategies for like state policymakers, for example. And then the other thing I like to say when I talk about cannabis, and because this is a cannabis research center, this may go without saying, but I give a lot of presentations to mixed audiences. To me, cannabis is almonds. I really don't care if you consume cannabis. Lots of us consume almonds for a variety of reasons. Maybe we're trying to consume less dairy, or maybe we're lactose intolerant. But almonds are produced in a mass quantity. They use a ton of water. They're all primarily exported out of the state, out of the US, and a select few corporations make a ton of money off of that, right? But we don't have any kind of moral discussions on like, well, should we eat almonds, right? To me, that's a kind of a conversation or discourse that really distracts from the main issue. Like, can my salmon come home, right? Like that's the issue I'm concerned about. And so I often find kind of moral quandaries around controlled substances to be a distraction from what I see as ecological impacts from an agricultural industry. But to get to the second part of your question, I wanted to do a couple things with the book. One, I wanted to document the harms that the Yurok tribe was actively dealing with as a result of trespass cultivation. I saw an absence of focus on tribal communities. And so I thought my privilege as being a graduate student at that time, I had the ability to produce publications that might be read as credible because I have those 3 little letters after my name, right? And second, and perhaps most importantly, and the focus of our conversation, I really wanted to situate what we saw happening with cannabis cultivation in a larger context and legacy of the history of California. And a lot of what we saw during the Green Rush was not surprising from a California Indian perspective because it demonstrated a lot of the same types of patterns that we have seen play out since the Gold Rush.
You mentioned some of these parallels between the gold rush and the green rush. And of course, settler colonialism in Northern California has always been sort of an extractive pursuit with logging and fishing and just exploitation of natural resources. But could you elaborate kind of on the key similarities that you see between these 2 time periods?
Yeah. So I think the primary one in my perspective is violence, and we can kind of theorize violence in a variety of different ways. Right, kind of direct violence against Indigenous peoples and bodies, but as well as ecological violence, or what a phrase I really like that comes from an environmental sociologist out of University of Oregon. His name's J.M. Bacon. He writes about colonial ecological violence. And so one of the things I really wanted to demonstrate in the book is that oftentimes the violence that we see enacted against lands and waters are actually paralleled in the violence we see against Indigenous peoples. And so I'll back up just a moment to kind of put my history professor hat on really quickly and kind of talk about the gold rush, because we are not taught this in K through 12. I often teach our intro to NAS, and like we'll do a survey of all my incoming freshmen. None of them learned that there was a state-sponsored genocide in California during the gold rush, and many of them tell me stories about mining for gold, or even like dressing up like miners and like doing little pageants, right, in elementary school. And so most of us in California grow up in a world where the gold rush is memorialized and celebrated, right? And then we think about miners as kind of heroic, rugged, individualistic, like frontiersmen, right? That we should aspire to, right? Like families can buy like a gold rush themed vacation package at Knoxberry Farm, right? Where you get to like pan for gold and like pretend to be a gold miner. But what is often excluded from that unit in school is that for California Indian peoples, the gold rush was an apocalypse. We created legislation in 1850 that facilitated the slavery of Indigenous children. And then immediately following that, the state established what are called volunteer militias that were compensated to go on expeditions to hunt California Indian peoples, right? And so most people don't grow up in California knowing that history, right? And so kind of I immediately started kind of thinking about the parallels between the gold rush and the green rush when I started graduate school, because I was reading all of these kind of popular media about the green rush as if that was a good thing. And I was like, oh, they actually have no idea about California history, right? And this kind of historical amnesia, right, of the violence required to form California as a state. And so we can kind of see overt examples of violence take place during the gold rush. And some of the examples of violence that I was witness to or was told about by tribal members and tribal employees is that you're like a covert operation. It doesn't really matter if you're like the DEA or like an 80-year-old woman looking for bear grass, right? And numerous folks would tell me stories that they were scared to go to certain parts of the reservation. They were scared to go to certain parts of our ancestral territory due to the potential of running into a trespass grow site. People told me stories about getting guns pointed at them, right? Where they had to like back away slowly. And so to me, in my mind, it was kind of irrelevant whether that violence was real or perceived if it prevented us from gathering, if it prevented us from tending to our ancestral territories. And so this was a big impact for a lot of our tribal members and our cultural practitioners. But I also saw it as an issue for tribal employees. who are native and non-native, and would need to access certain environmental quality monitoring stations to be able to assess, right, the environmental health of the reservation, of our ancestral territory. And when a trespass grow would spring up, often, right, they'll construct a gate or some type of infrastructure to prevent access. And so it put this tribe in a really sticky situation wherein we were seeing environmental harms occur from trespass cultivation sites, but simultaneously, those same sites were preventing us from accessing environmental quality monitoring data to be able to back up what we were arguing, right? That we were seeing environmental quality harms as a result of that, right? Another major parallel is ecological violence, right? And so we know during the gold rush that, like, what was it, 13 tons of mercury got dumped in California waterways between 1850 and 1860, right? We're not necessarily seeing mercury in our day and age, right? But we're seeing a lot of contaminants left behind at trespass cultivation sites. Dr. Murad Gabriel and his partner Greta Wenger have done a lot of excellent research on rodenticides, both in the Sierra Nevadas for tribal nations there, and they've also done some work on the Hoopa Valley Reservation, right? And so kind of seeing parallels amongst contaminants. And the other thing I'll say, so I actually had the opportunity to observe Operation Yurok in 2016. And I don't know what I was expecting in terms of like the contaminants, but like it is not like a neatly organized filing cabinet with all of the contaminants like neatly labeled in the appropriate containers, right? We're talking about like milk jugs filled with something pink, Nestle water bottles filled with something blue, right? And so before we even get to the conversation of how do we begin to remediate and clean up after contaminants, the first issue the tribe has to deal with is how do we identify the contaminants, which can be a pretty expensive process. And oftentimes we're finding contaminants that are not legal in the United States. They're manufactured here, of course, but not legal for purchase. And so that adds an extra kind of layer of complication to be able to identify like the exact problem that we're dealing with. And then the last one I will address, because there's numerous parallels, this idea of land dispossession. And so during the time in which the state is funding expeditions to kill Indigenous peoples, in California, there are 18 treaties in California that get negotiated, which would have set aside close to 8% of the state of California for tribal peoples. But when these treaties make their way to the Senate is like aghast. They're like, California, that paradise where gold is? No, why would we ever negotiate treaties with California Indian peoples? And so the feds put what's called a secrecy injunction on them. And so they sit in a lockbox until 1905. And that's why we have like what I deem an oxymoron, but we have landless Indians in California, and we have the most unrecognized tribes of any state in the US. And so while we're not dealing with treaty negotiations during the Green Rush, one of the ways of land dispossession that I document in the text is the spike in real estate prices. And so kind of when cannabis is at its height, right, we see property values increase significantly. And many tribal members have told stories about being priced out of their homelands, right? And right, there might not be a militia, but there's other external forces that are creating situations where tribal peoples have to leave their homelands, right? And then I'll just mention briefly, right, these parallels don't end with the gold rush. We see similarities amongst the timber rush, amongst the fish rush, and then what I call the back to whose land movement.
That's, yeah, you mentioned mercury getting dumped into waterways. I know I work with tribes around Clear Lake and Mendocino County, and mercury is still a huge issue in Clear Lake and for those communities. So yeah, I know water in general is a big issue, and a lot of these especially because you focus on trespass grows, so it's kind of all water theft where there's trespass grows. But water theft and access to water were recurring themes in the book and are recurring themes with cannabis cultivation in these rural places. Can you speak more about the impacts of cultivation itself, whether it be legal or illegal? I know you focus on trespass and illegal cultivation, but do you have thoughts on just the impacts of cultivation at, overall, on tribal water rights and on traditional ecological practices? You mentioned like harvesting and gathering, but other ecological practices as well that are impacted?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think this is one of the reasons that the framework of settler colonialism can be really helpful to our analysis. Because if we understand California as a place built on genocide and land theft, I think we can make the argument that legal cultivation is also land theft, right? If we're thinking about the settler colonial legacy in California. And so a couple of things I like to say to kind of begin this conversation. The ways in which Indigenous peoples understand and relate to water differs greatly from a settler framework that situates water as a natural resource. And so we hold important cultural relationships and obligations to water. We recognize it as a living entity, right, that has its own agency, right, and does not exist solely for the monetary accumulation of human beings, right? And so I like to start there. And then one of the things I do in the book, as I mentioned, I really wanted to situate cannabis cultivation within this longer historical trajectory. And so for me, it was really important to start that conversation with a history of settler colonial water rights in California. And when you examine sources by historians or economists who talk about the creation of water rights in California, they write about it as if there weren't any systems of water governance prior to invasion. The reality is, Indigenous peoples had complex systems of water governance, systems to manage our water systems, work in collaboration with each other, right? We know that many tribal nations share watersheds within the state of California. And so we see that type of collaboration and governance that exists prior to invasion, right? It is not kind of this lawless, empty wilderness as it is often written about in the historical records. And so our water rights in California are based off a system called the doctrine of prior appropriation. I refer to this to my students as like a glorified finders, keepers, losers, weepers, which for those of you kind of versed in federal Indian law, right, is the same type of rhetoric that John Marshall of the Supreme Court uses in 1823 to justify land dispossession, right? And so this doctrine of prior appropriation based on first come, first serve, as if there weren't already peoples there, right? And this notion of beneficial use, like, right, tribal nations have been advocating for additional beneficial uses to be added within the state that incorporate tribal uses and understandings of water, but beneficial use back in the day really just translated to, is this water being used to generate profit? If not, it's waste, right? And so our system of water rights that we operate on today is very much reliant on settler colonial ideas of water and water use. And the next thing I want to say, kind of most of the book is like laying out caveats, and I joke when I do book talks, like takes me like a half an hour to even like start talking about cannabis half the time, because we have so much California history we have to cover, right, for this to make sense. But the other thing I like to tell folks, right, is that our systems of water infrastructure that we have in California today, that much cannabis agriculture, particularly in like central and southern California, is reliant upon, was also born out of land dispossession and theft of indigenous lands and waters, right? The Central Valley Water Project, for example, had to flood Winnemem-Wintu territories, numerous village sites, burial sites, gathering sites. The state made a law, it was the 1941 Central Valley Indian Land Acquisition Act, where they said they were going to pay the Winnemem for all the land they destroyed to make the Central Valley Water Project. They never saw a dime, right? And so we kind of often the conversation starts as if like water infrastructure is established, that is neutral, that is objective, and that's just kind of the baseline moving forward. But from an Indigenous perspective, right, existing water infrastructure was born out of violence. So to continue to rely on it continues to rely on violence enacted against Indigenous peoples, right? So that's kind of all the context. And then we can kind of get into conversations around water use and cannabis. One thing I noticed, to me, it seemed like the discourse was really monopolized by like, we use this many gallons, not this many gallons, or no, I don't like that metric. Let's use this unit instead, right? And for me, kind of conversations or arguments about like over exactly how much water it uses were a little bit beside the point, because we were seeing entire streams be dewatered. Right. So in my mind, like, it didn't actually matter if cannabis used 6 gallons or 14 gallons per plant. Right. Does the stream have water in it? Is the stream like usable? Right. And so for me, that was kind of a more important conversation to think about. The other thing I try to kind of point out is that oftentimes we talk about like statewide data, right, around water use for cannabis. But that kind of, for me, that overshadows some of these really localized impacts, right, that we're having. Like, to me, like, statewide, it doesn't really matter if cannabis uses less water than rice or almonds or wine, but like, does this particular watershed, does this particular stream, right, that is serving this population of people have water in it? Those like felt like more significant and important questions for me, from a kind of coming from a more an Indigenous perspective. And then the other thing I kind of try to talk about in the book is so I will also take this opportunity to thank Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center, because I did rely on a lot of the important research around water use that has been coming out of the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center. But one thing I noted was the way kind of popular media was reporting on studies that were coming out of your Cannabis Research Center. One study I cite in the book, it's a Dillish 2020 study where he finds that over 80% of cultivators in Northwestern California lacked the storage infrastructure to meet the forbearance period. And Cal Normal reported on that study with the headline, "Legal marijuana farms are not a drain on resources." But I read that study as like, well, if 80% of them don't have the storage infrastructure they need, doesn't that mean they're going to violate the forbearance period? Right. And so the way kind of like cannabis lobbyists and the industry itself kind of were taking these studies around water use and kind of framing them to meet their needs. Right. And so I just have a couple photographs I'd like to show folks really briefly. Yeah, this. So here's kind of some of the things we would see at trespass sites. So what you're looking at here is a makeshift pond. Someone dug a big hole, they lined it with a tarp, they stuck a pipe in it, and then the other pipe is in the creek or the river. And one thing I'll share, right, a lot of the trespass cultivators we would see in Yurok country, like, they don't have a PhD in agronomy, for example. And so they don't realize that, like, if they get a contaminant, like a 40-gallon drum of something, that they would like need to dilute that in the bottle, right? So it's like 10% solution, like 90% water. Like, they didn't realize that, and they would just like dump a drum like into these little makeshift ponds. We would see this type of storage infrastructure. And when I was observing Operation Yurok in 2016, one of the guys on the crew kept telling me, all these growers are really bad plumbers. And like, I didn't understand. I was like, okay, cool. But what he was getting at is it's not only when the tribe is kind of calculating the water budget, basically, it's not only that they need to kind of calculate how much water is stored in like a given tank, but what he was trying to identify was that that tank is constantly leaking, right? And so it's the water in the tank, but then a 24-hour leakage, right? Because as you can see, it's kind of pooling here at the bottom. These are the little polyethylene tubes. I refer to them as black snakes in the book, and we'll discuss why in a little bit. I'll end my screen share there. Okay.
Ooh, that was good. Yeah, the environmental damage is is striking in that region. I do a lot of GIS work, and like you said, it's so different in different parts of the state. In areas where, you know, San Bernardino County, they're digging those massive trenches to do ponds, and they're also building berms, and just like almost little towns pop up in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And there's entirely different, you know, tribal communities with concerns for those areas. So yeah, statewide metrics sometimes don't really capture what's happening like locally, you know, in people's backyard.
Yeah.
I'm curious, this is a little extra question. I just really wanted to throw this one in, but do you think the transition from prohibition to legalization has helped tribes in any way? Do you think like this ability to at least know where licensing is taking place, or is it just a kind of a new set of problems that tribes have to deal with?
Yeah, so I'll be quite transparent that these are kind of just my observations and not necessarily backed up by like very like systematic research. And so my field work ended in 2018. Humboldt County developed their first, let me see if I can't remember the acronym. It's been a couple of years. The Humboldt County Cannabis Land Use Ordinance. And then that went through a couple of drafts. And one summer I was like finishing up field work and like starting the dissertation writing and needed, some income over the summer. And so I worked one summer for the Yurok tribe planning department. They were all wonderful. But because I was writing my dissertation about cannabis cultivation in Yurok territory, they were like, oh, great. You can deal with all of the permit applications that we are getting. And when I tell you that is the biggest bureaucratic headache I've ever dealt with in my life, I was so glad when that summer ended. And so essentially, and there are folks who could kind of get into the nitty gritty of this in much more detail than I, but as part of the Humboldt County Land Use Ordinance, while the Yurok tribe only has jurisdiction within the reservation boundaries, so extending kind of 1 mile on each side of the riverbank, as part of the process, Humboldt County would forward a permit application to the Yurok tribe if the proposed site application was within ancestral territory, right? As you saw from that map, our ancestral territory is massive, right? It is very remote. We're talking like logging roads that you can go like 15 miles an hour on, right? Well, I'm a cautious driver, so other people go faster, but it is not outside of the realm of possibility that to get to one site could be 3 hours of driving, right? Then the site visit, right? And then that's a team's entire day. Right? The Yurok Tribe Environmental Program is primarily grant funded, right? And so to kind of expect the Yurok tribe to kind of participate fully in this process was really expecting a lot of resources from the tribe, despite the fact that they don't receive any of the permit application fees, they don't receive any of the tax revenue, right? And so my kind of observation was that it was a really kind of inequitable relationship, right? And the Yurok tribe wanted to do their due diligence, right? They wanted to be able to make the appropriate recommendation of whether a site should be sited there or not, right? But the kind of quantity of resources, like financial resources, human resources, was very unrealistic. And then the other complication was just that, like, people like just we would see permit applications from like all over the world. And it was really kind of hard to track down who the applicants were because they would like create like multiple LLCs, and just like the paper trail of figuring out kind of the bureaucracy of the permit applications was really, really challenging. Regarding the impact of legalization on trespass cultivation, I've seen kind of different competing studies. So Washington and Oregon have both, there's a couple studies that have come out of both of those states. And the last time I looked at this, which was a few years ago, admittedly, and I'm forgetting which state published which report, but basically they said the opposite of each other. Washington was like, oh, following legalization, we've seen an uptick in trespass cultivation on public areas. And then Oregon like published a study that effectively said the opposite. And so I'll be honest, I haven't really been following up on that, but every summer my news feed on my social media is still flooded with like news headlines of like law enforcement makes another bust. So like I feel like I'm still seeing those types of headlines kind of in the growing season every year.
Yeah, I think you really capture what tribes are up against in terms of the notification process. And, even when there's so many applicants, and then as you mentioned, like, ancestral land is so much larger than the territories, usually owned by the individual tribes. So you're getting these notices for places that are maybe like dozens of miles away or far-flung locations. And like you said, staff and manpower to actually deal with all of those. And then there's still trespass grows, right? There's still illegal cultivation. So even with all the people coming online into the legal market, you still have illicit cultivation happening across the state. So
Right.
yeah,
And I think we often kind of want to talk about those as like rigid boundaries too, right? There are people who have entered in into the regulated system, but may not be in compliance, right? And so there is also this kind of fuzzy gray area too.
for sure, for sure. This is going so well. I want to keep on track with time, but
Yeah, of course.
thank you for your answers. It's been great. I wanted to talk a little bit about your other work, or your work as the co-director of the Food Sovereignty Lab, and
Yeah.
how that connects to broader questions of Indigenous land rights and community. How do you see cannabis regulation intersecting with other environmental and food sovereignty concerns for Native communities?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the lab. I'm really proud of the work that all of our amazing students and research assistants have done. It's the first lab of its kind in the CSU system. And then the other thing I will say is that we had to fight the university to get the Food Sovereignty Lab and TEK Institute because we applied for a vacant space on campus that was formerly a marketplace that would sell energy drinks and candy bars and potato chips, that sort of thing, had been vacant for a year. We applied to cite the Food Sovereignty Lab and TEK Institute there, and they said no because, quote, Indigenous knowledge isn't for everyone. And we're like, okay, well, that demonstrates the need for this lab, right? Because they were like, oh, well, it's only going to be for Native students, which are 2%. And I'm like, no, actually, everyone has to learn from tribal peoples in California if we have any hope of battling climate change. So we got a conditional approval, provided that the university did not fund us at all. That is the only lab on the entire campus that the university does not fund. And so we had our grand opening this past year. We were told that to construct and remodel the space, it would cost $250,000. The students fundraised that in 6 weeks. And then when we actually got the bill, it was over double that. So last I checked, we were $19,000 away from being able to pay off construction costs. So one way you can support the work of Indigenous ecological knowledge revitalization, you can donate to our Food Sovereignty Lab because our university doesn't pay for it. But I think one thing I'll kind of start this conversation with is that when we talk about Indigenous food sovereignty, that differs a little bit from maybe discourse around kind of food sovereignty that you may have read about in other contexts, right? Thinking about kind of the democratization, right, of food production and distribution to ensure that people have access to healthy and nutritious foods. When we talk about Indigenous food sovereignty specifically, we're talking about access to traditional foods, right? These traditional foods are, really good for you, like salmon and acorns is a complete protein, right? But what we're also talking about is the cultural connections, right, that we have to our traditional foods, right? So for example, Yuroks will talk about ourselves as salmon people, right? Our creation story talks about how salmon are put in the river to take care of us, and in turn, our one job, right, is to ensure and protect, right, our salmon relatives. And so access to traditional foods requires access to land. It requires access to water, right? And so traditional foods is a really kind of, I think, an important symbol of a lot of different social and ecological justice movements, right, that Indigenous peoples are fighting for. And so in my mind, Indigenous food sovereignty is land back. It's fire back. It is liberating rivers from dams, right? And so to situate this within a conversation on cannabis, in my mind, where we see a lot of food deserts, right, on various reservations throughout California, where we see a lot of tribal peoples experiencing health disparities because they don't have access to their traditional lands, their traditional foods. In some ways, the critical part of me is well, why are we dedicating so much land to cannabis and almonds and wine, right? When people don't have access to healthy and nutritious foods, and the production of our traditional foods in tandem, right, is restoring and healing our landscapes, right? And so for me, the kind of health and ecological disparities, it just makes sense to dedicate our ancestral territories to food production, right? There's actually, I know I've kind of shared a lot of kind of gloom in the presentation today, but I do want to kind of end this on some positive info. The Yurok tribe recently just remediated a trespass cannabis cultivation site, acquired the territory, and now is bringing fire back to it, and it's going to be a food village, right? So some exciting work. There's a lot of conversation to happen around cleanup. The state isn't allocating nearly enough resources to that, of course, right? But I think some of the positive steps that tribes are taking to remediate trespass sites to put them to indigenous traditional food villages, I think is like really exciting and a good example of kind of hope moving forward.
Right on, thank you. I was wondering if you would privilege us with a little reading from your book. We talked about it. I know we're getting close, but if you have something prepared, that would be wonderful.
I do. It might take us to the end of our time, but I'm happy to stick after a few minutes if folks have questions, if the reading takes a little bit longer. As I mentioned a little bit earlier when I showed some photographs, I refer to the polyethylene irrigation tubes we often find at trespass sites as black snakes. And here's my attempt to explain why. The July sun was hot on the back of my neck as I struggled to find my footing on a steep mountainside along the Klamath River. Yurok ancestral territory is located here in northwestern California and has been the ground zero for cannabis production since the 1960s. At the height of the contemporary cannabis green rush, Yurok ancestral territory was under siege by large-scale trespass cultivation. Illegal and unregulated water diversions ran our streams dry, degraded water quality with chemical pollution and human waste. My colleagues with the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program were tasked with dismantling the cannabis irrigation structures that were sucking tribal water resources dry and documenting the ecological impact of cannabis cultivation. We were looking for thin plastic black tubing, hard to see and even harder to remove. As sweat poured down my face, the quantity of tubing seemed never ending. I ripped up as much polyethylene tubing as possible in an attempt to liberate our tributaries. And within a short time, there was a gargantuan pile of black snakes ready to be removed from the landscape. However, the concern that additional black snakes remained continues to linger. The onslaught of settler colonial destruction is not relegated to history. It is very much a part of our present and lived experiences as Indigenous peoples of this region. Our river, the lifeblood of our people, has been under attack since settler colonial invasion a little over a century and a half ago. The history of water development and extraction in the Klamath Basin has disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples, water, plants, and wildlife. The Klamath Project of 1905, the first Bureau of Reclamation project, led to the construction of 4 deadly dams and extensive agricultural pollution of the Klamath River, effectively collapsing the possibility of future sustainable subsistence fishing economies. This has had detrimental impacts on the cultural and food sovereignty of Native peoples within the Klamath Basin, as well as on fish, wildlife, and plant species. Within Yurok epistemology, salmon are understood as relatives, ancestors. While the word genocide is reserved for human beings within a Western paradigm, we conceptualize the fish kill as a genocide. In 2002, our salmon relatives faced a genocide of cataclysmic proportions. Gordon Bettles argues that the tragic 2002 fish kill that left 70,000 salmon rotting along the banks of the Klamath River was caused by a collision of cultures that began when the first ships landed on the east coast of North America in 1492. Similarly, Tasha Hubbard argues that the strategic and systemic slaughter of buffalo also constitutes an act of genocide. In other words, destroy the buffalo and one destroys the foundations of Plains Indigenous collectivity and their very lives. A century of water infrastructure development and increasing demand for water for grazing and agricultural production dramatically decreased the flows and increased the temperature of the Klamath River. This created an environment in which disease could spread rapidly, and it did. Conservative estimates suggest that in 2002, at least 30,000 Chinook, 600 coho, and 1,000 steelhead succumbed to a deadly pathogen known locally as ick. Within Yurok epistemology, the Klamath River is a living being. As a Yurok person, I understand the Klamath as a vein that connects me to the earth. It is central to our sacred geography and is often referred to as an umbilical cord to the earth. To describe Indigenous relationships with water, Yazzie and Risling Baldy have developed an analytical framework of radical relationality, within which water is not a resource to be weaponized to boost the capitalist economies of settler nation states. Instead, water is a relative with whom we engage in social and political relations premised on interdependency and respect. Struggles over water figure centrally in Indigenous fights for sovereignty, nationhood, and futurity. As Indigenous peoples around the globe rise up to defend and protect our waters, we are fighting for the future of the earth, our people, and all living beings. In 2016, the eyes of the world turned to watch the Standing Rock Sioux Nation and their allies spanning the globe rise up to challenge the construction of an oil pipeline. The Oceti-Sakowin Nation of the Minnesota, or Missouri River, have a prophecy about Zuzeka Sapa, or Black Snake. Nick Estes, in his book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, writes, prophecy told of Zuzeka Sapa, the black snake extending itself across the land and imperiling all life, beginning with the water. From its heads, or many heads, it would spew death and destruction. Zuzeka Sapa is dapple, and all oil pipelines trespassing through Indigenous territory. But while the Black Snake prophecy foreshadows doom, it also foreshadows historic resistance and resurgent Indigenous histories not seen for generations, if ever. To protect Unsimaka, or Grandmother Earth, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples will have to unite to turn back to the forces destroying the earth, capitalism and colonialism. But prophets and prophecies do not predict the future, nor are they mystical, ahistorical occurrences. They are simply diagnoses of the times in which we live and visions of what must be done to get free. I first heard this story on November 16th, 2016. By then, water protectors were facing arrest. 6 days later, law enforcement began the use of tear gas and water cannons. Safe on my college campus, I attended a Standing Rock teach-in at the University of California, Davis. Everyone was brought up to speed on what had happened to water protectors. Educational resources were suggested. However, the part of the event I still think about quite frequently was an Oceti-Sakowin Nation prophecy shared by my colleague, Dr. Jessa Ray Growing Thunder. Apart from Growing Thunder being a terrific storyteller, her words captivated me. Like in Estes's telling, Zuzeka Sapa, or the Black Snake, would bring great destruction and the people would have to rise up to defeat it. Though I arrived at this teach-in prepared to think about Standing Rock and the ways I could support the activism occurring on my college campus, as I biked back to my apartment, my mind was not on Cannonball, North Dakota at all. No, I was thinking about the ancestral homeland of my people in Northwestern California, and it dawned on me that my people too were fighting their own Black Snake. During the summer of 2014, I was hired as an environmental tech at the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. The morning of July 21st, I stared out the window of the commute rig as we made our way up Highway 101 to Klamath, California. I remember sitting at my desk, sipping weak coffee, logging into my email. I saw an LA Times article that had been forwarded to all tribal employees. Massive raid to help Yurok tribe combat illegal grows. While I sat safely in that office, other tribe members and employees, accompanied by dozens of law enforcement officers clad in camouflage and carrying assault rifles, made their way upriver. Their goal that morning was to eradicate cannabis cultivation and document the resulting damages both within and beyond the boundary of the Yurok Indian Reservation. Operation Yurok, a tribe-led cannabis eradication campaign that took place from 2014 to 2017, designed to eliminate environmentally hazardous trespass cultivation. One of its primary concerns was to address illicit water diversion used for cannabis production. But we didn't have just one clearly visible black snake to battle. There were hundreds, probably thousands, hidden away in the hills. Our black snakes are not constructed of metal or filled with oil. Instead, our black snakes are made of polyethylene, small and thin and sometimes nearly invisible if you don't know where to look. Our black snakes are scattered over hillsides, siphoning water from springs and streams to thirsty cannabis plants. There was and continues to be fear that drought conditions and climate change, with the added impact of unregulated water diversion, could result in another catastrophic fish kill. This cultural collision culminated in 2002, but it began with invasion. As Yurok people, we can't talk about water diversion for cannabis without talking about salmon and the health of our river. The river is already overtaxed and overallocated and must endure the impacts of human-caused climate change. This is true of many rivers throughout California, all of which have significant ties and connections to indigenous peoples of that region. When our rivers give us a choice between salmon or cannabis, I hope the answer is an easy one. Salmon constitute an ecological and cultural keystone species. People, plants, and wildlife depend upon salmon and their unacknowledged ecological labor. If salmon disappeared from the Klamath Basin, the system would collapse. Their well-being is fundamentally tied to ours. As Yurok people fight for the very survival of salmon, they are fighting for their own right to survive, to live in a world of ecological and spiritual balance. Salmon's resilience keeps alive the hope of a better future for Yuroks and all California Indian peoples. I'm going to end it there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And the timing was perfect as well. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great read. So yeah, I appreciated it. I was looking forward to your book as it was getting ready to come out, and I read it right away for my qualifying exam for the PhD program. And yeah, thank you for offering the discount code for anybody that's here. Well,
yeah, totally.
Yeah, buy the book. So just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to hand back over to Michael for a minute just to kind of close us out a bit, and then we'll circle back and do a Q&A. Does that work for you, Ken? Okay, great. Michael, take it away.
Okay, great. Can you pin me, Joanna?
Oh,
Do it myself, but
there
okay.
you go.
All
There
right.
you go.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so yeah, I'll just say a few words, and then I know people probably have to leave at the top of the hour, but if folks do want to stay behind, and it sounds like Dr. Reed has a few extra minutes to chat with folks, so we'll leave this channel open. But yeah, next week, or in 2 weeks actually, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Robert Eiler from Sonoma State University, who's been doing work on economic development and cannabis throughout kind of the North Coast region, and some of the impacts of cannabis legalization and policy on the region. And he'll be in conversation with Janine Coleman, who's the executive director of the Origins Council. One other thing I'll mention is that in early May, on May 2nd, and this will be up on our social media and such, is that we're going to be having a panel with the Nevada County cannabis growers, as well as the Rural County Representatives of California, RCRC, and also the California Resource Conservation Districts, where they're going to be discussing essentially bans and permits as approaches to county and local policies towards cannabis, and what some of the benefits, deficits, and so on are of that. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them. And a few other events will be coming up. But you don't need to hear it all from me. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter on the left-hand side, which is that QR code. We'll leave this up for a few minutes as we do Q&A. And then if you want other links to the website, to other resources that we have, it's the right-hand side. You can also sign up for our social media as well on the link tree. But yeah, with that, I'll hand it back. And yeah, I know there are some folks in the audience that might have a few questions. This is really thought-provoking. Thank you, Dr. Reed, for your time, and also for your consideration with this book. I think it gives us all a lot to think about, to work with, and to be oriented towards. So I really appreciate all the effort that you've taken over the years. So
thank you very much.
You bet.
So yeah, we're just at the top of the hour now, and if that'd be great if we could stay on for a few more minutes and do some questions, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, happy to. I just have to submit budget expense reports after this, so please let me procrastinate as long as possible.
Hear that.
Yeah, I have some of the same work to do. Okay, so from the chat, I'm wondering, do we have so yeah, one from the chat here is, how can the state support remediation / cleanup on tribal land?
Money. That's actually, I don't know if this actually gets to the kind of your question, but one thing I did notice when I was doing my field work is that there were often discrepancies between the tribal nations and the county regarding cleanup and how much resources folks were willing to allocate to that. And so kind of the tribe's perspective was like, we're not just going to dump all of this on someone else's indigenous territory, right? And so often kind of ethical ways of disposing contaminants and garbage. And also, I didn't get a chance to show photographs of it, but like the amount of stuff left behind at trespass cultivation sites would blow your mind. My kind of comparison to hoarders is not hyperbolic. We're talking about so much kind of leftover equipment, household garbage. Like one site had like 1,000 bicycles. I have no idea why or how they got them all up there. But like lots of kind of abandoned, broken down vehicles, like leftover batteries, refrigerators, like ovens, like a whole bunch of stuff. And so often the most ethical route of disposal costs a little bit more and is more time consuming. And oftentimes, right, the kind of the county's MO was like, what's the cheapest way we can do this, right? To which the tribe would often have to kind of push back against that. One thing of piece of information I like to share with folks when we're thinking about the cleanup of cannabis cultivation sites. There was a Sierra Fund report that came out in 2008. It said that there are still 50,000 mines left over from the gold rush. 87% of those mines present either human and or health impacts. And so like my question for the state is like, hey, if you haven't figured out how to clean up after the gold rush yet, like what makes you think you're equipped, right, to handle the ramifications of all of these future rushes? But like I've seen estimates from our planning department that there are like 15,000 sites in Humboldt County alone, right? And so yeah, cleanup is still a huge issue. And then Dr. Gabriel, Dr. Murad Gabriel, he's done a lot of important research kind of thinking about the legacy impacts of a lot of the contaminants. And so like we know, right, that the tribe isn't able to get to most of these sites, right? There are still a lot of sites that continue to need to be cleaned up, right? And many of those sites likely have contaminants in them. And as I mentioned before, right, they're not neatly labeled in the appropriate jars, but they're in like milk jugs or empty water bottles. And eventually those plastics are going to degrade, right? And whatever is in them is going to leak into the soil, into the water, right? And so I wish I had a more clear-cut answer for you other than fund it, state of California. Because I think the tribe is already, many tribes across California are already kind of disproportionately kind of funding the burden of that, despite the fact that they don't receive the same type of economic benefits, right, as several of our counties and our state government do.
Right on, thank you. Do we have anybody from here on Zoom with us that wants to unmute and ask a question in person? No? Okay, and if not, I would ask one more, and I hope I don't take us too off topic and we're already over time, but you know, you're careful to mention that you're not a scholar of, you know, cannabis policy per se, that this work is about resource extraction and about benefit to the tribes. I'm curious, outside of cannabis, I know we're here at the Cannabis Research Center, but what do tribes need to sort of, like, well, what kind of tools or resources do tribes need in order to achieve, you know, tribal sovereignty and to like meet their needs and aims for the goals going forward? Is it funding again? I'm curious. Yeah.
Well, really the thing I'm kind of I get to it in the conclusion of the book, but like where I see us going forward is land return. And to me, like what I tell, so I'm at Cal Poly Humboldt and we have a lot of students come to our institution because they're interested in environmental sustainability and environmental restoration. And what I tell students is that actually land return is one of the most surefire ways to restore areas. And there are numerous studies that have come out of like South America, Central America, and parts of Asia that document when Indigenous peoples are given formal title to their lands, we actually see rates of deforestation plummet. We see reforestation occur within a very short time period of land return. And so there have been numerous examples of land return in California. And I think kind of what we need next is a really systematic documentation of the ecological benefits of land return. And so for me, when I think about like how we move forward and we heal our landscapes, to me, it makes more sense to kind of focus on the holistic way in which we relate to and understand our relation to lands, right? To me, kind of targeting a particular industry or a particular environmental harm is kind of going after a symptom rather than the root cause. And to me, I see the root cause of ecological destruction, right, as colonial invasion and removing the ability of people who have been here since the beginning of time from stewarding their lands in the ways that they always have, right? And I know a lot of folks at the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center are scientists, and what better kind of time frame, right? Like if our studies are relegated to like 5 years or 10 years, if we get a really good grant, like Indigenous people's time frame of study is 15,000 years, right? And so like, what better empirical data could we have than that? And so I'm really kind of thinking now about like, how do we, like, what resources do we create to document the benefits of land return, not just for Indigenous people, but for everybody, right? My colleague and friend, Dr. Katja Risling-Baldy, always says, like, imagine a place where we can drink the water and breathe the air. Like, don't we deserve that? like, if settler colonialism can't give us that, like, let's dream up something better. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. That's a great answer. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the reading and for your thoughtful answers to these questions. And thank you, Michael, for hosting this for the CRC. And yeah, everybody buy the book, follow up.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't write
Thanks again,
academic books
everyone.
to make money, but yeah.
Hey, I'm still
Please
like,
buy
it really is a great read. So I hope people do buy it. But yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you again. And I look forward to talking again soon.
Yeah,
Have a
thanks
good one,
so much.
everyone. Thank you so much for
Take
having
care.
me.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.